You'd be surprised the folk has seen things and afraid to tell anybody about it.
Former Nashville, Tennessee Councilman George Darden has never seen a UFO, but he thought he knew a good deal when he saw one. He was wrong. Darden hoped he could create a few jobs and some tourist income by building, with city funds, a UFO landing pad, sort of a Nashville-style welcome wagon for visitors from the Crab Nebula and beyond. The plan was defeated by a council vote of 27-1.
Got one vote, which was a start, and that was my vote.
Darden then tried to build the project with his own money, but was denied necessary permits by his skeptical, amused colleagues. The newspapers had a lot of fun at his expense, and the councilman even landed himself on the Joan Rivers show. Politically, he was doomed, and so was his idea.
People have come right here in front of my house in tour buses because it came on the radio that I had built it in my backyard, which I had not.
Darden says he never thought aliens would actually land in Nashville. He merely thought UFOs were a good gimmick. What he didn't know is that the seeds of his demise had been planted decades before by intelligence agencies who secretly plotted to make certain that the media and the public would never take UFOs too seriously, and that anyone who did take UFOs seriously would be subjected to ridicule and laughter.
And all the way through, you can trace a deliberate pattern of disinformation, deception, the laughter curtain, the ridicule, the debunking, the UFO bashers that come out, there's still a few of them around, and say that anybody involved with UFOs is a crackpot.
And I fault the media for that. They've never, ever taken the time to look at the reality of it, to look at the evidence and talk to the people who have first-hand knowledge. They go out and they'll talk to some poor yo-yo who's wearing a beanie with a couple of antennas up there, who said, I've been aboard this ship and I went to Venus and I had a love affair with... Well, the media focuses in on that guy, but they won't focus in on a scientist or retired military or a police officer who can tell them firsthand what I've seen and what's happened and what I know.
August 1950, Missoula, Montana. A photographer captured movie footage of two silvery disc-shaped objects. The Air Force said it didn't know what the objects were, but that it was possible the craft were Air Force jets. 3 years later, a panel of CIA scientists dropped the word possible from the file and declared that the objects were jets, contrary to other evidence. Tremonton, Utah, July 1952. A Navy photographer filmed the formation of flying objects, which he later described as disc-shaped craft. The Air Force and Navy extensively analyzed the film, decided it didn't show planes, balloons, or birds, but didn't say what the objects were. The following year, the same panel of CIA scientists decided, after just a few hours, that the film showed seagulls. Wisconsin, 1952. A formation of UFOs is confirmed on radar. Bermuda, 1954. Again, radar captures images of craft described as UFOs. In the late 40s and early 50s, it became abundantly clear to governments around the world that something unusual really was flying around, something that was seemingly beyond any known technology. Rather than admit their ignorance and confront the issue head-on, governments did then what they tend to do today. They lied.
I think, in a nutshell, that the government painted itself into a corner about UFOs for very legitimate reasons 45 years ago. And I think the paint's still wet. They didn't know what to do about it.
Flying saucers.
Lonnie James spent 26 years in the Air Force, mostly as a radar operator, and says he and others tracked UFOs on numerous occasions in New Mexico, Texas, and North Dakota. Higher-ups would routinely issue lame excuses.
We picked up an aircraft, or a blip, I should say, on the radar scope that was acting very strangely, making 90-degree turns on the scope. We watched it on the height finder first, and it appeared to just rise in height and descend at will. We don't have any idea where they're coming from or what they are. And it's being suppressed by our own government. The individual who told us it was a weather balloon or who told us it was a missile from White Sands had to be an idiot. Total idiot.
This former Air Force officer doesn't want his identity revealed, but recalls daylight UFO sightings while stationed in Alaska.
They appeared to be discs of some kind or another, and silver in color. And they were just sitting there, perfectly stationary. As the jets proceeded to go after them in different groups, they came back together again at incredible speed. It was just like the blink of an eye. Nobody knew what they were, and they were completely beyond our capability, and we knew, you know, we thought we knew the capabilities of the Soviets at the time. They didn't have anything better than the MiG either.
Many people trace the beginning of the modern UFO era to the June 1947 sighting of 9 objects by pilot Kenneth Arnold while flying over Washington State. Arnold compared the flight of the objects to a saucer skipping across water, and the term flying saucer was born. In reality, sightings had been taking place for years before Arnold's brief encounter. During the final months of World War II, air crews on both sides of the war frequently encountered strange, almost playful balls of light, which came to be known as Foo Fighters. We thought they might be Nazi secret weapons. The Germans and Japanese thought they were ours. After the war, thousands of so-called ghost rockets were reported over Europe, especially Scandinavia. We suspected they might be Russian weapons. The Russians thought they were ours. UFOs burst onto the American scene in 1947. Kenneth Arnold's was one of nearly 900 sightings that summer. In early 1948, a military pilot, Captain Thomas Mantell, chased a UFO over Kentucky. Mantell radioed back that the object was metallic, of tremendous size. A few minutes later, his plane crashed, and Mantell was dead. The official explanation was that he was chasing the planet Venus and blacked out for lack of oxygen. A metallic Venus didn't wash with many people. Former U.S. Senator and Air Force General Howard Cannon served with Captain Mantell.
He went to altitude and he kept trying to go, trying to follow it. He reported in, did report in what he was seeing on the radio, and eventually he just spun out and went in.
On the surface, all was calm, but behind the scenes, military officials were greatly concerned. They worried that these unidentified objects might be advanced weapons from an enemy nation, so secret studies were begun. A joint Army-FBI study concluded that the objects were real, not imaginary, that they appeared to be metallic, disc-shaped, manufactured craft capable of great speeds and evasive maneuvers. The existence of this study was kept secret until 1976, 29 years later. The Air Force began its own study centered at Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio and dubbed Project Sign. In August of 1948, a top-secret evaluation was written based on an analysis of 200 early cases. The Project Sign report concluded, astonishingly, that UFOs were almost certainly interplanetary craft. But when the document was forwarded to Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg, the general disagreed with the conclusion and ordered all copies of the report destroyed. Vandenberg later confided that such a conclusion would have, quote, caused a stampede, meaning widespread panic. Air Force staffers got the message. Any conclusion that UFOs were from somewhere else was unacceptable. They rewrote their report, reached no conclusion, and that report was accepted. Despite the inconclusive bottom line, this report was also kept secret until 1985. That was the last gasp for objective UFO studies. Project Sign was renamed Project Grudge. According to a later congressional report, the primary job of Grudge was to explain all UFO sightings. Even with this mandate, Grudge staffers still found they could not explain 23% of UFO incidents. Their final report chalked up these unknown sightings to, quote, psychological explanations, the first official declaration that people who see flying saucers are crazy.
The government has been aware since the late 40s at least that we are dealing with, in many cases, solid vehicles, not from this earth, that they are powered by extremely advanced propulsion systems, and that in some cases occupants have been seen.
The Air Force went to great lengths to convince the public there was nothing to worry about when tens of thousands of people from the Dakotas to Mexico witnessed a formation of bright UFOs. The Pentagon dismissed it as a misidentification of the constellation Orion, even though at the time Orion could only have been seen from the other side of the Earth. When witnesses reported the apparent landing of a UFO at White Sands, New Mexico, the Air Force determined that what had been seen was the planet Venus, to which one scoffer replied, "What an historic occasion, the night Venus landed on the gypsum flats of New Mexico." The joke making the rounds in those days was that for every 200 UFOs sighted, the Air Force could explain away 210. Even less cooperative than the public were the UFOs themselves. Once again, they seemed determined to refute all suggestions that they didn't exist. In 1952, the U.S. was hit by a massive wave of UFO sightings, more than 1,500 separate incidents in all, and many more occurred that weren't reported. Those who question why UFOs haven't landed in Washington, D.C. may be interested in what may rank as the most dramatic UFO incident of all. In July 1952, the nation's capital was buzzed by at least 6 UFOs on 2 consecutive weekends. The objects were picked up on numerous civilian and military radars. Fighters were scrambled but were unable to get near the elusive lights. Photos were taken of the objects. Confidential reports hinted the objects may have been from other planets, but the public explanation was the sightings were merely the result of a temperature inversion, a thin excuse which didn't convince many people, especially the Pentagon's own radar operators. Even more embarrassing for the Air Force, the D.C. incidents occurred at the same time as a major Pentagon news conference called in order to formally dismiss UFOs.
We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations.
With its public credibility on the wane, the Air Force launched yet another so-called study, Project Blue Book, which was soon inundated with new sighting reports. The first head of Blue Book, Captain Edward Rappelt, somewhat naively attempted to conduct an authentic study, but quickly surmised that his superiors didn't really welcome such an effort. In disgust, he quit, then wrote a book which told the world that a cover-up was in the works, that UFOs were real, and that they may be extraterrestrial craft. Blue Book stumbled on.
From the Air Force point of view and the government point of view, it was primarily a public relations exercise. To the Air Force in those days, UFO reports were just an annoyance. They were, and I asked Hector Quintanilla, Major Quintanilla, who was in charge of Blue Book at the time, and he said, it's not our job to do research, it's the scientific community's job. And every time we go to the scientific community, they say there is nothing to UFOs. So who are we to say that the scientists are wrong?
Despite the pretense of being an objective study, it became abundantly clear in later years that Blue Book was a public relations exercise, and that the best, most intriguing UFO cases were never included in Blue Book's files. This memo, issued by an Air Force general in 1969, confirms that UFO cases which affected national security were sent to another program, one that remains secret to this day.
So the notion, which most people seem to accept, that the only group concerned with UFOs was this wonderful scientific group, Project Blue Book, which it never was anyway, is nonsense, as clearly enunciated by an Air Force general told to look over the whole situation.
Former Air Force Colonel Wendell Stevens was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Base when the UFO studies were headquartered there. He was assigned to a special project in Alaska, along with a team of civilians and several planes packed with sophisticated electronic and photographic equipment.
And we succeeded in getting collecting information probably 2 or 3 times a week. And some of the cases, of the contact cases, were quite spectacular. One of the key pictures that I remember was a time when a disc, about a 30-foot diameter disc, got in the slot behind the trailing edge of the big wing and ahead of the leading edge of the small wing, and only inside of the wingtips, within 50 or 60 feet of the fuselage, and sat there for 2 or 3 minutes. And they took pictures with all these cameras, and we would package it in a metal box, a little locker that was locked and chained to an officer's wrist and flown to Washington. Every night we got one of those. None of that